Welcome, ladles and jelly spoons, to Discover Dorico for December 2021. I can see the chat, so let me know if you can all hear me and if all that's okay. And if you have any questions as we go on. Today is about layouts. I know it's not the last Wednesday of the month, but I thought we ought to get this session in before you're either busy or away for Christmas or having a Christmas party or just wine and cheese, as our government now tends to call it. Yeah, okay, don't get involved in the politics. Just get on with the gig, like the Muppets said. So, yeah, let me know in the chat if everything's okay and if you have any questions on this. This is I suppose, similar to a session we did in March 2020, which was on staff and system spacing. So March 2020. So the lockdown seemed like a novel idea. We just started, I guess, in some countries. It wasn't that long ago, really. But I thought it was worth having a bit of a recap on some of the things in that session. And this is like a part two of some of that. So we're going to look in some more detail at some areas. Things like page justification and, why sometimes the systems spread apart too much or more than you want. How do you change those? What options should you change? And also things like, I've got an extra system on one page. How do I get that onto the previous page? So we're going to look into all of those kind of things. So when I was looking at kind of layout type options, I thought there's a number of things that you could do to make the music fit better on a page, but which one do you want to do? Which one do you want to change first, and what will impact something else? So here's a quick list. I'm blocking my page turns. Here's a list of things off the top of my head that I thought of as I was thinking about this session as things that you could change to make the music fit better on the page, or to get better spacing or anything else. But the question is, which one do you want to change? Which one do you change first? And which one is going to impact something else? And I can see a couple of names in the chat who've asked me questions about this before, so hopefully this one will be useful. So what I've done is I'm going to sort this into a sort of a bit of an order, where we've got column A and column B. Column A we're going to look at first. In some cases, they're not really variables even. They might be set by a publisher if you're fortunate enough to be working for one, or they're at least the kind of thing that you might set once for a project. And then you should also, I've kind of put them in an order of kind of from the outside in, if you like. So the paper size, the page margins, the music frame margins, the flow header, the master page template, those things. So we'll have a quick look at those as a bit of a review, if you like, of the session we did in March last year. But we'll kind of look for, so where are all of these options if you wanted to find them? So that even if you're just starting using Dorico, you can kind of say, right, so how do I change all of these options? So we'll recap those, and then we'll look at some of the options in column B and how they can sometimes affect each other, and which ones you might want to use. So we'll look at a couple of use cases in a file I have of, what difference would this make and why would I want to use it, on what will happen and that kind of thing. So if there's no immediate questions, no, good, sounds good, yep, good. Let's get a move on then. So the first thing is, let's get rid of this one.
Something I found on the web. According to techrepublic.com.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much.
Internet connection.
Alexa, stop. Yeah, thank you. Technology, hey? So according to something she found on the web. Me! So what we're going to look at this part, I think. So the first things, the things that were in column A. So if you want to flick back to that, I will put time markers so you can flick around in this session if you need to after the session. I'll put a link into the December 2020 session. So if you want to have a listen to that one as well, then you can. So the first ones that were in column A, things like the page size, paper size, if you like. So layout options, Command-Shift-L or Control-Shift-L is where we're going to spend a fair amount of time for this. So these are your layout options, of course, and you check the paper size first. I have been sent projects before where people are they're doing everything on A4 or letter, when actually they want to print it bigger, at least for the score. So don't forget that, of course, when you choose a layout on the right-hand side, Dorico is showing you the options for that layout. So I've got the full score selected here, and it's choosing A3 because I'm using an international computer, as it calls it, not an American size. And if I click on flute, then it will show A4. When I open this dialog, Dorico automatically selected the layout that I'm looking at here. So because I was in the full score, Dorico's opened that one. So just as a quick recap. And I guess just as a complete recap, if you look in the Dorico preferences, so edit preferences or the Dorico menu preferences on a Mac, in the general section, you can set the default paper size type, which for me is automatic. But you can choose here international, which mine currently is, or North American, and that will also help set your paper size. And if you prefer not to use millimeters, if you want to use inches or something else, then you can set that in here. So that's kind of top level, if you like. So inside these layout options, this is where you initially want to set your paper size. What size paper is this on, and your parts. And you will probably, if you're making the same kind of changes to lots of parts, you want to select all of these parts. So don't forget there's a button down here to select all the scores or all of the part layouts, so that you can make the same paper size change if you need to all of the parts. So that's the first one. The next one is page margins, which is actually a bit further down in this dialog. So page margins here, you can define. Now these are just the default ones, so this is the margins around the edge. And if you were in engrave mode, I'll just press escape for a second. In engrave mode here, you can see there's these little lines here, and my frames are bang up to the margins here anyway. That's the default in this template anyway. But you can see we've got page margins. So that gap around the edge, that's what you're setting as the page margins. And obviously, that's going to have a big impact on where the music fits, where everything can fit. What size should your page margins be? Well, actually, I've been listening recently to the Scoring Notes podcast, scoringnotes.com, and the last 2 sessions they've done are on parts. So they've had is it a party on parts? Don't know. It was part 1 and part 2 anyway. So there's 2 options you can listen to there. And Philip and David are talking about the various options and things you might want to consider. And it will include things like page margins if you're using a booklet, if it's going to be bound at all, if it's going to be potentially on an iPad. There's all sorts of things there. So this is where you would set them in Dorico. And you can have different margins and mirrored margins depending on whether it's booklet and various other things, or you want the same margins on various things. So there's various options you can set in here. But you've got your page margins. This is where you would set them. Obviously, working from the outside in, that's a good thing to check next. The next one would be the music frame margins. So if I just having a look at this again in engrave mode here, the music frame margins, when you're in the space option here, the staff spacing option here, you'll see there's a light blue section at the top. Hopefully it will show up on the screen at your end as well. If not, have a look at it in Dorico, and there's one at the bottom here. And this is the gap between the bottom of the music frame margin and the bottom of this staff here. So this is the spacing that Dorico's set here. And you can see again at the top here. Now there's also a green box inside, which is the flow header. But you can see on my screen at least, and hopefully it's coming out on the video. If not, have a look in Dorico. And that one is the music frame margin. So that's set in this same dialog. Here was the page margins. Underneath it is the music frame margins. So that's the space at the top and the bottom, which is shown by a blue section on the page. So obviously you want to potentially set that. Maybe you want to reduce it. Don't forget that also applies to other pages. So the same music frame margin is here, and that might also depend what's at the top of the page up here. Which leads me on to a couple of other things, which is the flow header. So do you want this flow header at the top? These are all things that you should probably decide quite early on before you get into any of the other nitty-gritty of what's on a page and everything else. The flow header. Do you want the flow header? If you don't want the flow header at all, in page setup flows, it's still in this same section. I'm just using the little shortcut to get to it here. In the flows section here, you can set whether you want to show flow headings, never, not for first flow, or for all flows. The Dorico default is for all flows because Dorico's sort of set up to do multi-flow or multi-movement works, really. If you never want that, if you always, like in this case, I just have one movement, it happens to be movement 3 in one file, and I might not want that, then you can just choose never. Again, you might want to say select all and choose to turn the flow headers off. So if I press never, press apply, then that flow header will disappear. In actual case, in this case, I do want to show it because I'm using it as a subtitle, if you like. But that's where you would set it, whether you want it or not. Just a note, if you've changed this option and nothing happens on your page, think, but why has nothing happened on this page? You probably have a little red triangle up here on the right hand side, which is a page override, and you'll want to right click on that page, and you would have an option then to remove the page override. And then Dorico is then following the template again. And you can tell when I click on these pages here that it's following the template because it's highlighting underneath which template it's following. So that's the flow headers. Do you want them or not? I suppose also with that is the size of the flow header, which is set by what's in the flow header, which you can choose down here on the right hand side in engrave mode, and you can choose what you want in the flow header. It can be a simple case of removing, for example, the number, if you don't want the number to be shown and you just want to use flow title. You might want to put something else in, you might want to make it bigger, smaller, or anything else, but that will obviously set the size of that flow header in there. And don't forget, when you're on a part, that they have their own flow headers, so there's their own little flow header option here, because you might want a different flow header for parts, and just changing this one in here will then change it for all of the parts, but that is different from the one that's on the score. Here's the score. So a few things there about, you know, the kind of working from the outside in, the page margins, the music frame margins, the flow header. Do you want those kind of things? Because that's obviously impacting on space and where the music's going to fit. A few other little global things. This is still really part of the recap for the previous session. The master page itself, or the template if you like. So if I double click on the first template here, then these regions, what is in all of these and where the music sits. Don't forget, Dorico tends to start on this page because the first page of music tends to be a right-hand page. So you can set these options in here. What do you want these to be? I suppose similarly with the title and composer and everything else will be, what font size do you want? What size do you want these boxes to be? Where do you want the music to fit? Actually, can the music get closer? You can overlap these frames if you want to, but all of these things you want to check first. And if you want to use any of these tokens, you can right click and you can choose tokens from here. So there's project tokens and flow tokens and various other options if you want them. So set up those kind of things before you go moving staves around, or setting where, I don't know, your page breaks are or that kind of thing. Define these things first, because otherwise if you change these later, it's going to change where potential page breaks and other things are. So these are all the kind of global things. Also, don't forget, of course, that was the first page. You also want to define for all of your other pages, which is the default section here. So this is for the score. Where do you want your page number to be? What do you want to display at the top of the page? How big do you want it to be? All of those bits, set them first, because obviously it's going to impact where the music sits. And also when you then go to a part, and I'm just using the shortcut to go to the next layout, it's in the window menu if you want it. So there's next layout and previous layout shortcuts. When you're in the part, of course, it has its own first page template and default page template, because there's a layout name at the top if you want it. Maybe you want the title higher. Maybe you want to change any of these. Maybe you have a subtitle in here and not a flow header. All of those, decide them first. And as somebody's just said in the chat, I do find myself overlapping these all the time. That's okay, but make sure you defined all of those areas before you worry about where the music's sitting on the page and that kind of thing. Also, don't forget you can now import and export these. So there's master page sets at the bottom. And if you want to, you can import and export them. So if you've already decided all this in another project, you can import that into this project and then apply all of that a bit more automatically. Going back to, especially on the score, things that are also going to impact things and should probably be considered at the beginning are things like the initial staff gap. So I suppose actually maybe this is more obvious in a part. So this initial staff gap here, which is shown here, in fact I'll go back to this one for now. So this it depends on the style. Real book style doesn't have this. But depending on the style of the piece, do you want that initial gap? Because obviously that's going to impact how much space there is for the first system, which will have a knock-on effect on everything else. It's in the layout options in staves and systems, and it's the indent first system of flow by the number of spaces. Choose all of your parts. If you're changing one, you probably want to change them all. So choose all your parts and update this to say, do you want that to be indented or not? Similar gap at the beginning would be on the score, the names that you have here. What are the names that you want? Do you want in layout options, in staves and systems, in the what are we talking about? Staff labels, yes. So it's at the top of the list anyway. These staff labels, do you want them to have the full name at the beginning and abbreviated later on? Do you not want any labels? You can do that. That's more common for parts, as you can see when you click on one. But in the full score, you probably want full score and abbreviated. But then there's the options for transposition. If it was a B-flat trumpet, do you want it to say B-flat trumpet or trumpet in B-flat? It all has impacts on the spacing at the beginning. Do you want that transposition to also be shown in the abbreviated staff labels or not? Because that will impact the width of the page and how much space there is on the page there as well. So this is where you can set the global options for these layouts as to what happens. You can override some of these in case you need to know in setup. When you are editing one of these instruments, and you edit the names, there's an option for showing the transposition, whether you're following the layout options that we just looked at, whether you're always showing the transposition, so that's an override, or never. So those two are the overrides over the layout options. So you can choose there whether you want the transposition and how the transposition shows. Probably the last one in this kind of global section is actually in the layout options vertical spacing, which is at the bottom here, the staff visibility. Obviously, if you're going to use hide empty staves, it's quite possibly something you want to say at the beginning. So is it a French style or a study style score where you want to hide any staves that are blank, so hide any of the empty staves so that you can condense everything as much as possible? Or is it a case where actually you never want to hide empty staves because you always want all the staves to be shown in the conductor's part to make them consistent between pages or anything else? Maybe not so much in the other parts, although maybe if it was a percussion type score, which is still a part really, or if it was a piano and singers, and you've sometimes got SATB and sometimes you've got choir, you might use hide empty staves to remove some of those extra staves, and obviously that has a big impact on the number of pages, where things sit and everything else. So make sure you set that one early on as well, before you're deciding exactly where things sit. So that's kind of all the things that were in column A in that first slide I showed you. Now we can look at the things in column B and how we can kind of manipulate what's actually in these music frames once we've decided on what all the space is and everything else. I'm just going to have a very quick check to see if there's anything I've missed from the comments. I'll probably come back to the comments at the end, but just to check. No, I don't think there's a simultaneous translation for YouTube into other languages. I'm terrible at French. And yeah, I'll come back to a couple of those, I think, if there's anything else. If you've struggled to show page numbers and things, then it may be that make sure there's a page token. So, for example, this page 1 has no page number anywhere on it. And that, in this case, is because that the first page template here doesn't have a little page token to show that. So whereas the default one here has, I mean, it's tiny up here, but it says it's the little page token. In fact, it's so small in here you can't really see it. So just drag that box out if you want to have a look at it and see what they look like. Right click and you can choose the option anyway. But that's why you get page numbers here, but you don't get them on page 1. So make sure, it could be that maybe there isn't one in the template, so it doesn't know where to show it. So let's have a look at the kind of the options that were in our column B. So these can probably impact various other things. Oh, one more that you should probably look at first. Almost forgot. Casting off, especially if it's a jazz style or a film score style and you're doing a set number of bars per system or systems per page, then in layout options, in the staves and systems, there's a casting off section. And this is where you can set a fixed number of bars per system. Obviously, this is going to have a big impact initially on how many pages and and spacing and everything else. So you probably want to look at that quite early on as well and not set it later. Obviously, you can override that if occasionally you need to have more or less bars on a line, on a system, then you can use that. And there's a similar option here for the number of systems per frame. But you probably want to set those quite early on as well. So the options in column B. The first one is actually things like, in our vertical spacing here, we have a section for collision avoidance. So in here, minimum gaps and automatically resolve collisions. Now actually, in a lot of cases for parts you probably don't want this, and for the score it probably is more useful to be on, but it's on by default in Dorico for everything. And it's just worth bearing in mind. So this will be adding sometimes a bit of extra space between things, and we did cover this a little bit in one of the previous sessions. But just as a quick example, if we were looking at, so for example, I don't know, somewhere, let's say here, if we force something for a minute just to be, to add a bit of space, and especially if it had a slur on it, and maybe there was a slur on the music above, then Dorico is going to try and make sure that these don't collide. So if I turned off the collision avoidance for this one, so vertical spacing, it's actually inside here. If I turn this off, and can move this on the page a bit and press apply, then these two will collide. So Dorico is now applying the minimum gap here, the 6 spaces between the staves. We'll come back to that in a bit. But that's where the collision avoidance may be useful. So I just thought I would tend to leave it turned on for a score, but just be aware that that is also it will also be impacting things. Often for parts, because it's just individual systems, you may not need that. It may be quicker to turn off the collision avoidance and spot any little manual things where a rehearsal mark has bumped into something. It might be better to do that sometimes, and then you won't get big gaps between staves in parts. But it may depend on what you're working on. So the other thing I wanted to probably look at next is things like staff size, and I've already mentioned the Scoring Notes podcast, and they actually also mention the Moeller guidelines. So there are kind of some set sort of staff size guidelines as to what size should the staves be, but it will depend on the paper you're using, the size of the paper obviously. It will depend in some cases which instrument it is, because as actually a Scoring Notes in the podcast said, I don't remember, I think it was David said, it depends. Are you a violinist or a timpani player who's got your instrument between you and the music, and so it's further away, so you might need bigger staves? Or is it a piano where actually it's relatively close to you, so you could actually get away with smaller staves? But anyway, one of the next things you probably want to look at is the staff size, and at least be aware of. So when we were looking in our page setup, where we set the paper size and everything else, the next option down says space size. So what Dorico is actually defining is the space in a 5-line staff. What is the distance between 2 staff lines? If you're being picky, it's the distance between the middle of the staff line and the middle of the next one, not the top or the bottom of, doesn't matter how thick they are really, it's the middle of those. So there are 4 spaces here. So each space is 1.75 millimeters, which when you add them up 4 times is 7 millimeters. So the Dorico default is a 7 millimeter staff. And it was interesting when David and Philip were talking about this on the Scoring Notes podcast about, they may vary this slightly, they're basically still staying between probably about 6.5 and 7.4, depending on, paper size, the instrument, who it's for, all of those kind of things. Also some interesting considerations I hadn't thought about, like also with the page margins, if this might end up on an iPad and somebody's going to crop the page, is it going to be slightly smaller on their screen because it's on an iPad? Those kind of things are potentially also, just to add another variable to the list, also worth considering. But and I think, was this maybe in behind bars as well? It could be. But, the Dorico 7mm staff is probably a good average. But you will find, some people want a slightly smaller staff. And obviously, if you do that, everything's going to get slightly smaller, so you get more on a page. So if we have a look, at some of these options, that may also impact how much music you're getting on the page and how the music is laid out. But this is where you can set it. You can set it manually as a staff size if you want to. So if you don't like the rastral sizes, if you wanted 7.2 or 6.8, then you can just change the space size here and it will calculate for you. You see it's calculating here, or you can even type in this box if you want to. And if you're working in inches and you've set that in preferences, then you can also you can use that here as well. So this is where you might want to sometimes change. I'm going to discard my changes. You might want slight different changes in layouts depending on who's playing it, how far away from the music they are, but you can do that because they're all set up in layout options. There is actually an option for manual staff size, which I wouldn't really use very often. By which I mean, if you were to click on a staff here, in fact, if you right-click on the staff, you can then choose a staff size, and you can choose a percentage or a custom staff size. So, for example, if I go to 60%, then the flute part in its entirety, all the way through the score, is now at 60% size. I wouldn't normally use that one. You see, actually, the flute label I don't think is smaller. No, the staff is. That's more commonly used, I would say, if you're doing a piano and soloist and you're creating a part for the pianist to read and you want to include a small version of the soloist line in that layout. That's more commonly what it's for. It's not normally for, in this layout, this is how you set the staff size. So I wouldn't normally use that one. That's more of a kind of an override at the end, maybe. Another case is occasionally, we'll talk about why there's a big gap on this page later. The other thing you might occasionally want to use is if there's one page where you could just do with that one page just being very slightly smaller, people might not even notice, but it would make a bit of difference to this. Then you can add a manual option to this. If you're in engrave mode and you add a system break, so you can use the buttons on the left, or you can just press Shift S. When I had something selected, it gave me a system break. If in the properties panel you then go to the space size, then this will always default to 1.75, that's the Dorico default staff size. But if you now vary this and make it smaller, then all of the staves on this page from this system break onwards will now get smaller. So, for example, these are all 1.75. From this point on, they're all now 1.45. So maybe just to get a little bit more music on, you want 1.55 spaces, just to make things fit. And then maybe on the next page, you want to add another system break and go back to the normal staff size. You can do that. So you can say, here's the normal staff size again. So if you just need to change one page just to make things fit, right at the end, maybe that might be an option to do it. But in most cases, you probably don't want that option, so I'm gonna take those away. And of course, our old wait for next system break. If this is accidentally left on, then you'll get this. Don't do that. Just tick that box. So I'm going to remove that system break because I don't want to make a manual change. I would also say if you do that, it is actually sometimes a bit difficult to spot that you've done that because Dorico doesn't automatically tell you this is a difference. And you might be going, I had a file sent to me recently, and my colleague Marcus as well. We were looking at the staff size and we couldn't work out why things weren't adding up. And it's because as well as the rastral size being set here, a manual override had been applied to every single staff to change the custom size of those staves. And it's not normally the best way of doing it. So, in some individual cases, yes. In this one, no. Page turns. There's a comment about page turns. We'll get onto that. So, just moving on for a minute. Note spacing. This is actually can sometimes be really, really helpful. So let's have a look at the flute part. I'm using my next layout shortcut there. So in the flute part here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. And on page 5, this is a bit more spaced out than the other pages are. So the next section we're going to look at now is things like note spacing and page turns and breaks and justification on the page and that kind of thing. This is where we want to get to. So at the moment we've got 5 pages. If you go into your layout options, it's all layout options today, isn't it? In the note spacing section, this is where Dorico sets the note spacing. And the note spacing means it's allowing a certain number of spaces, 4 spaces, between, allowing 4 spaces for a crotchet and slightly less for a quaver, etc., and more for a minim. And you can have a custom spacing ratio. We don't normally, but you can. There's all sorts of things you can use in here. But the useful one might just be this top one, the default space for a crotchet. Now 4 is because Dorico is saying at the beginning, we as a team have to set one default as stave size, staff size, whatever you want to call it, and as a note spacing size for any type of music that you might create. And it might be that actually you prefer slightly smaller spacing on things, either the staff or the note spacing, or slightly bigger, but we've set one default. So this is where you might want to change it on a part basis, or maybe as your favorite, your default. So in this, Dorico does a fairly good job, I think, of laying out this music and making it look nice. But if you said, you know what would happen if we change these 4 spaces to 3 spaces? So you can see all of the other bits are changing as well. So now I'm just going to press apply. And now our flute part in the background here is now down to 4 pages. So just by reducing the default space for a crotchet, and of course all of the other notes, just to make all of the note spacing slightly tighter, we're now using 1 whole page less of music. Now, it's up to you whether this is a bit too tight in some cases. Maybe you want to, allow a bit of space somewhere else. Maybe that's actually just a bit too much. Well, you don't have to do whole numbers. So if we go back to, to this one, you can also set percentages, or if you wish, you can type in a decimal number. So you can say, actually, I want 3.25 in here. Dorico will convert it back to a percentage for you. So you can set various options here and see what difference it makes. So on our last page, look. If you do 3 1/4, then we've just got a little bit of music left over on that last page. If we set it to 3 1/2, then we've got more music on here, but it's not now spaced out to the bottom of the page. We'll get to that. So the note spacing can actually sometimes, just a small tweaking of note spacing can actually make a difference. So don't forget our default option was 4. And sometimes just reducing it just a little bit will actually make a big difference. And in this particular case, it will make the difference between how full the page is and how how things are spread out. Now we're going to change that in another option a bit later. But this is the kind of difference that you can make just with note spacing. So actually, the note spacing can be a really useful option to look at on an individual part by part basis to make the music fit a bit more comfortably in a fairly automated way, really, because it's affecting all of the pages. But that means that will also affect potentially where page turns are, because you'll be looking through the music and going, well, where might make a good page turn? Well, maybe here would make a good page turn. But if you've changed the note spacing, maybe it wouldn't. So this is bar 183. If I change the note spacing and we made this, I don't know, 3 1/2, let's say, then actually this no longer makes a good page turn. Not really, because it's now in the middle of a page. So this is where all of these things that we talked about in column B, if I'm referring to my original slide, all of these things in column B can affect each other, and you might need to decide actually which one is... some of them are not adjustable. The staff size might be set by publisher, or the space size, they might have a particular one they're using. It might be that the music font that they're using is a bit narrower anyway, so you need to adjust the note spacing. Some of these are not variables, some of them are, but they will affect each other. So if we were at the defaults here, this is probably a good place for a page turn. So to add a system break in here, by which I mean break the system so that put the rest of this on the next page, or maybe you want to do it here to leave the multi-rest at the end of the page so they know they've got time to do a page turn, then you can use the buttons on the left over here or press Shift-S for a system break. So now that's at the end of the system. Dorico is making those two systems meet the edge of the page, and we have a system break, so we're starting again here, which of course forces more music onto the last page as well. So this is where page turns are affecting everything else. You can also, if you need to, you can use a frame break. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, we actually wanted it to be here. If I added a system break at this point, then of course it's just going to force that onto a new line. But if I press Shift F for frame break, then I'll get a frame break just up there, and Dorico will put all of this onto one page. And like I said, there are options over here for system and frame break that you can use as well. Also, the opposite is true. So there's make into system and make into frame. So if you want to bring a bar back, then you can use those kind of options as well. So if you wanted, I don't know, this bar up here, for example, to be also on the same page as the other one, then you can select a range, sort of select the beginning and the end, and you can use make into system, or not make into frame, make into system, and force it all onto the same option, onto the same system. And you can use that if that is also useful to help you set page breaks. and that will, of course, affect where the rest of the music flows onto. It may also depend on whether it's a booklet or a spread, because in this particular part, if it's now 5 pages, it may be that it's now a booklet, so somebody needs to take into consideration page turns. Scoring notes, Philip and David did talk about, I think Elaine Gold recommends 4 seconds, I think, for a page turn. So work that out based on your tempo. If you can allow that, great. But if it's a spreads setup where they've just got 2 or 3 pages on the music stand, you don't need to worry about page turns, so maybe it doesn't matter so much. But that kind of thing can also make a difference. Obviously, piano parts probably often do, but then do they have a page turner? So yes, have a listen to that Scoring Notes podcast, and they go into some of that in a bit more detail. So we've looked at kind of a couple of ways that we can do those page turns and use system and frame breaks, which will also impact everything else, and also the make into system and make into frame. But let's look at some of the other automatic justification options. So let's start with this flute part since we're on it. So the last page here is more spread out than the other pages, and I suppose if this was a live session and you could feed back to me in a short time, but at the moment there's at least a 30-second delay, then I'd say, so does anybody know why? No, I won't do that. So let's have a look at why. The best way of finding out why is to have a look at the options in Layout Options Vertical Spacing. This will be set to the Dorico defaults. We looked in the previous session about how you would use this dialog, setting the staff visibility first and the hidden hide empty staves, the vertical justification, the minimum gaps, and the ideal gaps. Let's look at how some of these all interact with each other, especially the vertical justification, because actually I don't think we've completely gone into this. There's 2 options here that when you say them to people, they go, oh yeah, okay. And then you go, now explain to me what they actually mean. And they go, oh, I don't know. So there's 2 options: justify distance between the staves and the systems when the frame is at least 60% full, and justify distance only between systems when frame is at least 80% full. And people go, oh, okay. Well, if I change one, I can probably find something that works. Well, let's look at how and why, shall we, as to why you would want to change these and how they make a difference. The first, maybe the biggest thing to realise is that there are 2 options here. On every page, only one of these options will apply. So the trick is which one is applying to each page. I suppose that's what we want to know. So in engraving options here, if we go to engrave mode, we click on this option here, which is our staff spacing that we were looking at earlier. At the bottom of each page, there's a little number which says 65% on this page, 65.6, 96.9, and the earlier pages are about 87, 87.5, yep, and the first page is 92.2. So, depending on how full the music frame is, and this music frame obviously is smaller because of the title and everything else at the top, and the flow header, and and everything else. This was a smaller music frame, so it's 92.2% full. This one's 87. So, the last page was more spread out because the last page is 65.6. So the last page is saying, am I more than 60% full? Yes. So I will justify the distance between the staves and the systems. So it will spread everything out on the page. Am I more than 80% full? No. So I won't use this option. So this option is not being used on this page, but this top option is being used. So this says 65.6. If I set this to 70, for example, then now the staves here, they're not being spread out because 65.6 doesn't meet either of these 2 thresholds. Now, in the case of an individual option like this, actually either could apply. So to explain both of these, let's have a look at the score as well, and then we'll come back to the part. So in the score, we've got this really big gap between all of these systems, and you may not want this big gap, and you may have done a piece of music in Dorico where you say, this gap on this page, not, maybe that's okay, but all of these other pages, the gap is just too big. Why is Dorico making this such a big gap? So if you go to your layout options, I'm now on the full score layout options, of course. we can now have a look at these percentages for the score. Let me just zoom in a bit so you can see. So hopefully you can see this one says 81.2. 81.2. In fact, they are all very similar. 82.8, 82.8. Because this music doesn't have much in the way of dynamics or things going outside the staff, then it's fairly consistent between all of the pages. You may have more variation between them, but in this case, they're all doing the same thing because they're all just over the 80%. So let's have a look at these options. So the two options, the important thing to look at is here, is that the first one says justify the distance between the staves and the systems. So we now on this page, unlike the flute part, we have staves, individual staves, and we've got two systems on this page. So there's two options. There's justify between the staves themselves, so the gap between all of these staves, and there's spread the systems out on the page. So let's just have a look to starters. If I set both of these to 100 so that they don't apply, and press OK, now we can have a look at this score and see what's going on in this case. So now you can see, if we go back to the beginning, we've now got a bigger gap at the bottom of the page instead, which also might not be what you want, but it's a good starting point to work out. So what's Dorico doing when it's laying out these pages? So here we've got all of the staves set in here, and of course Dorico's telling me what the gaps are. So where's it getting this information from? This is, and we covered this partly in the earlier session back in March 2020, the staff-to-staff ideal gap. And I said in that session, it's minimum gaps. The minimum gap here, and it's minimum often because, don't forget, it might be using collision avoidance to add a bit more space. But the minimum is, and in this case we've got lots of notes and things, but the minimum gap is going to be 6 spaces. And this says 10.5 millimeters, because in our page setup, a space is 1.75 millimeters, and we have 6 of them. So if we bring up our little calculator, 6 spaces between systems at 1.75 millimeters is 10.5 millimeters. Hooray! And if you do the same calculation here, you see this is because these are different families because of the way the groups are set up, and between the contrabass here and the harpsichord, that one is going to be using this, which is the staff group to staff group option, which is 8 spaces. There's also an option for the harpsichord part itself, which is also 6 spaces. So you can see now where all of these come from. We've got 10.5 millimeters here, we've got 14 millimeters here, so you can see what all of these spaces are. So this is what Dorico is now using because it's not justifying. I've turned the justification off. I've set both of these to 100, so neither option is applying, and now we can have a look at each option and see what it actually does to this page. So let's have a look at one page. Let's take this page 2 as an example. So at the moment, we have all of these gaps here. In fact, we also have the gap between the two systems here at 17.5, and that's because the gap is 10 spaces, 10 times 1.75, I can even do that one in my head, is 17.5. So that's how Dorico is laying out the page. That's why you've got a big gap at the bottom of the page. So what we want to do is spread things out, but not to the same extent we did have, not with a really big gap in the middle. The justification is going to help us. So when we enable this justification option, so let's say this page at the bottom, I can see it says 82.8. So if I set this to 80, then this option will start to apply on any page that reaches 80. So now you can see it's all spread out. So what's it doing? It's justifying the distance. So a bit like with text justification in a newspaper where it's lining up left and right edges and it's making all the music fit those edges. Bit difficult to read sometimes, but that's what it's doing. Dorico's doing that top to bottom on the page. It's making sure that the music is spread out and fits the top of the music frame and the bottom of the music frame. Obviously, the music frame margin takes into consideration the little blue section at the top and the bottom, but it's spreading this everything out. But it's spreading out the systems and the staves. You see, that's where this option makes a difference. So now the distances here, which were very small, and we calculated there were 10.5 and 14, then now they've spread out. So that's why you could change the ideal gaps and nothing would happen, because Dorico's already overridden that and said, actually, I'm spreading these out for you. But it might mean that you now don't have a big enough gap between unless you put system dividers in, it might now be more difficult to tell you've got two systems. So it might be that you want to increase this inter-system gap, maybe, let's say it's 15. Maybe you want to increase this to force a bigger space between the two, maybe. So that's where, and I can reset this back to its default of 60, which it means that any page that reaches 60% full, and the notification is at the bottom here, it says 84.4, it will now use this option and will say, I'm now going to spread all of the staves out and the systems to make sure it fits the top and the bottom of the page. So what's the next option? The next option is justify the distance only between the systems when the frame is a percentage. So if we set this to 80, because this page is at 84, so I'm going to set this to 80 and apply. Suddenly we've got a big gap between here. So why, when we've already set this one, did we get a big gap? And it's because only one of these two can apply. So if it reaches 60, it applies this option. But if it reaches 80, it applies this option. It kind of takes over, if you like, so this is the option that's being used. So what Dorico is now doing is it's only justifying the two staves, only justifying the two systems on the page. It's moving the two systems, but it's not changing the staves themselves. So the staves have gone back to their smallest option, which was the 10.5mm, 14 between and everything else. They've gone to their smallest option, but then it's spread the two systems apart so that they meet the top and the bottom of the page. So the question is, which option do you want? And remember, this applies across the whole layout. Now in this one, I'd say potentially you don't want this bottom option. And even if you reduce this, for example, to 30%, well, it's always going to apply because this one takes over. So it might be in this particular case that I want to set this to 100. I never want that to apply. Or maybe there's a page that's very, very full, 95% full, and I want it to apply to that page or those pages that are very full. But most of the time, I want to use this option. So that's where I'm going to change this, just in this case, to so that it basically doesn't apply. And maybe, as I said, maybe I want a bigger gap between the systems, and that's where I could put 15 in here instead of 10 or whatever size I've calculated that I want. So now, on this layout, I now have, maybe I want a slightly bigger gap actually between these, but I now understand why, and I can, hopefully you understand why you can you will get things the way you want them, and why sometimes you will get a big gap in the middle, or your staves are further apart, or anything else. It depends whether Dorico is justifying those gaps or not. If you don't want any justification, if you want to set the gaps, then you want to turn both of those options to 100 so that they never apply. The page has to be 100% full, at which point it's not doing anything because the justification is already applied. So let's have a look through a couple of other options. So this one now, because all the music is fairly consistent, we've got basically the same look through all the pages. And like I said, if you check the bottom here, we've got 84.4, 84.4, almost. In fact, I couldn't have made this any better. They're all basically the same. Quite unusual that would happen. If you'd added some more dynamics and slurs and those kind of things, then you would probably get different results. But actually, with the options I've now set, apart from the first page, they're all basically the same. So we've now got a more consistent look and less of a big gap between the two systems there. So let's go back to our flute part and have a look at what was going on there as well. So the flute part, it's got some of the pages are very full, 87, 96, and this page is now 65.6. So on the flute part now, he's selected the flute part, we can now have a look at what's going on. So at the defaults, which were 60 and 80, 60 for this top option, 80 for this one, this is what we had on the flute part. So quick recap what was going on. This page is at 96.9, so it's gone, this one has applied, it's taken over, it'll only justify the systems. Now, the systems are the staves at this point, but this page here is saying I'm 65.6, I haven't met this one, I have met this one, so I'm going to justify things and spread them out. So it may be that in this one, if you haven't, changed the note spacing or anything else, and this is where you're at, and you don't want them to be so spread out, well, if you tell Dorico not to justify, with either of these options, or with, in fact, we only need to change this top option, don't we, because it won't meet the bottom one anyway. So let's say it was 60, 80. if we just change this one option here, so it's 100, so it never applies, or anything bigger than 65.6, this part will never justify that page. So the last page now has the space. So we've now got this, and maybe that's the look you wanted. You're probably more likely to have put some page turns in and various other things. Maybe you reduce the note spacing down to 4 pages initially. There's all sorts of things you could have done. But that's why this one is a bit more spread out on the last page and how you could change it. It's the page justification that's doing it. And you can look at this percentage down the bottom here and find out which one of these applies. So the default was this, where it's more spread out. And if you change this top option, then this is the one it's applying to. 65.6 means it's met this option. It hasn't met this option, so this one hasn't taken over. Have a look at a quick look at a few other parts. There might be a couple of other examples. So here's the harpsichord part. This is at kind of 79.7. You may get slight difference with piano music because also there's the gap between the two piano staves as well, or harpsichord staves in this case. They're all actually 82.8, 84. What's the last page doing? Now I haven't looked at this one, so this is complete coincidence that it happens to work on 11 pages. It may be, though, that if you'd, for example, changed the note spacing and made things tighter, you might not want to do that in this case, actually. It may be that here you've got another example here where this is at 64.1. They're more spread out. Maybe you didn't want that. Maybe you actually want some space on the last page to add some text or something else. So maybe you don't want it to spread out. That's where you could use that page justification option and tweak that if you wanted to. Notice I'm still not dragging any staves around. At no point today have I manually dragged a staff anywhere, because I really would avoid doing that until right at the very end. And only in, if you really had to. Violin part. This one's a little bit more spread out because this has not met that 80% option. It's only met the 60% option because it's 76.6. This one is only at 34.4. So this is why this violin part never spread out like the flute part did, because the flute part had met that 60% threshold, so it had justified itself. This part hasn't, because it's only 34.4. So that's why you can see, what do you want to happen. Now in this case, it's 4 pages, it's got some multi-rests. Actually, you could probably squish it down to 3 pages in this particular case without too much work. Bit of note spacing, probably. Maybe, where there's some of the multi-rests, maybe you can, fit more on a couple of staves using, making to system or anything like that. And you could use that. You could probably get it down onto 3 pages rather than 4. To be honest, I think there's an awful lot of space at the top here. So I would probably, right at the beginning of the session, before you're looking at all of these layout things, decide on these kind of spacing things at the top. You could also, on one part if you wanted to, if you're allowed to reduce the music frame margin a little bit, get a bit more space on each page. Maybe reduce the bottom down here. If you're not got anything else at the bottom down here, maybe you can reduce the music frame margin at the bottom. You could easily get this onto 3 pages. So there's a number of things there you could look at on that part to make them fit. This one is fair. If we haven't changed the top of anything, I probably would have. If you haven't changed the top, then this one is 96% basically most of the time. So Dorico's done a fairly good job of laying that out and justifying it. And this last one, oh no, it's not the last one, second to last one, the cello, easily get that down to 3 pages. No problem. Bit of note spacing, that would probably do it in one shot without messing around with anything else. The page margins or anything else. Just tweak the note spacing a bit. You'd make that one fit. And the contrabass. Depending on what you're doing on some of the other parts, if you apply the same note spacing thing, you've got lots of multi-rests in here, you could reduce slightly if you wanted to. You could probably also get this one down to less pages. So I don't know, don't normally use any of these other options very much, but all of these blue bars, of course, if you needed to add a little bit more space, you won't need it in this piece, but if you've got a rehearsal mark and slurs and something else and they're kind of colliding a bit and you need to pull things apart just on one page manually, you can use these. You can click in this little box, you can use Alt up and down, you can use Command to move in bigger spaces, you can move one system if you just need to get a little bit more space for any reason. When you've got the red box selected, just press delete to get rid of it. But generally, you don't need to do that. There's no reason to do that. And make sure you do that if you're going to do it at the end, just to make a little bit more space somewhere, because if that system moves when you're doing some of the other bigger changes, you're going to cause yourself even more of a mess. At least Dorico will show you, because it will be red. It will show you that change has happened. But if you forget to click on this tool to come and check, you might not realise. I'm often sent scores by people who say, why is this not working? Well, one of the first things I would check is, in this staff spacing tool, have you manually adjusted anything, or is this the Dorico doing it? And in a lot of cases, something earlier in the project has been manually dragged. Don't do it. I know it's a other music program thing to do. You shouldn't even do it in that program, to be honest. You're applying overrides. It's not good practice. It'll save you a lot of work in the long run if you don't do it. Similarly, if you want to make the multi-rests a bit smaller, if you're allowed, you could potentially. I'm using Command Alt left to make the multi-rest smaller, and if you could then get a few more notes on that system, if that would help, then that may also help in some cases. I don't adjust note spacing very often either. I think there's a session I did where we looked at one of a page of the Riemenschneider, and how they were really tightly compacting things onto that page, and to make accidentals fit in some cases, and to make it space nicely. That's when I really used it, in anger. So have a search on the YouTube channel for the Riemenschneider example, because that was one where I really did change a lot of it. But in most cases, I don't really manually change the note spacing very much at all. So that's kind of some of the things you could tweak to reduce the amount of paper you're using, save the environment, even if you're not using an iPad. But yes, the trick really is, especially on these justifications, is to use this staff spacing option to check what the percentages are here. So this is 56.2, so that's why the layout options, vertical spacing, 60% is not spacing this page out. If the Dorico default was 50%, or if you'd set this as 50%, then the last page would be more spread out. Probably don't want that. So that's where you can tweak these settings on a per layout basis if you want to make sure that especially the last page and also any other page is justified correctly. And if you're doing this on a score, then you can tell, depending on how many systems you've got, and in obviously larger scores, it doesn't matter so much because you've got so many instruments, they're probably filling the page anyway. But where you've got this kind of option or study scores and you want to set the gaps between things, then that's where you can do them. I didn't mention, but if you want them, then in staves and systems, there are system dividers if you want to turn them on. I think never is the default, but you can turn them on when the number of staves differs or when the minimum number of players is present. So if I did it in this case, if the minimum number of players is 4, then in this layout and this layout only, I would get system dividers. There's also options in the engraving options as to whether you want system dividers on both sides of the page, just one side of the page, and various other things. But if you don't want those, then they are off, I think, by default. But now you can see how you can lay out the music for this score with 2 systems and get the gap that you want between the staves, because I've basically turned this one off, so it's not doing that. It's separating the staves to make a bit more space. My preference, choose yours. So it won't be using this exact spacing. It's justifying, it's spreading them all out, and then it's saying I'm going to use at least 15 spaces between the staves, between the systems, and so that's why you can set the gap that's in the middle. So actually, I did say maybe I want them to be slightly bigger. I'm just going to say 20 instead. So I'll now set a minimum of 20 in the middle. It's not as big as it was, a decent. I can tell they're 2 systems, and then you can tell what's going on the page, and that's how you can use the justification to understand what's going on. So the important thing that I don't think we've ever really said before is it's only one or the other option that happens on each page. So maybe it would be nice one day to have even more control over these, but on every page it says, have I met this threshold? Have I met this threshold? This bottom one will win. If it meets that threshold, it's the one that will win. That's why things spread out more sometimes. The system spread out more. So set it to 100 if you don't want it, and then this one will win, and you can set the percentage if you need to tweak that accordingly. So, oh no, Daniel's online. Oh, I didn't realise. I'm just kidding. Thank you. Thank you for answering some questions, Daniel. So I'm now just going to have a quick flick through and see if there's anything I've missed that would be useful for me to talk about in this. So we'll just do a quick Q&A. If you've got other questions and you want to type them in the chat now, then I'll get to them in a second. I'll just read through them all to see if any of these have already been answered as well. So talk amongst yourselves. David Lowe asked a question about eighth notes displaying in pairs rather than in groups of 4. And Stephen Taylor answered, thank you. You can look in the notation options. And yes, there's options for beaming and grouping and various other things. It can also be set by the meter. So if you want to set a specific grouping style, for example, you can set, in 6/8, it's normally 3 and 3. But if you set 6/8 as 2 plus 2 plus 2, then Dorico will group them as group the quavers or eighth notes, depending on which country you're in. It will group them that way, and you can set that the meter can display still as 6/8 if you use square brackets. So basically, there are options. Have a look on the Steinberg.help. There's a page on popovers. There's a PDF on popovers, what you can type into popovers, and that includes all the time signature options. Or if you Google it, there's a session we've done, Dorico session, and there's also the short clips that Anthony's done, the Tips Tuesday. So blog.dorico.com and the tutorials section, or you can search that site and find the answer there as well as the Steinberg.help manual. Let me just check. For creating exercise numbering instead of straight bar numbers. You might depend on the exact example. In some cases, yes, I'd use flow headers because you could set those up. In some cases, you could use text. You could use rehearsal markings. In some cases, it might depend exactly what you want. Maybe if you want to send us an example. And if there's not a video on it already, maybe that'll make another useful session. Actually, the Riemenschneider one is probably similar again. The Riemenschneider had lots of individual examples and they were all labelled. So have a search on the YouTube channel for the Dorico Riemenschneider session I did. How do you manage page turns? I think we've hopefully covered that, Stephen Bashworth. If that's not the case, then let me know. I haven't said, if you want to email me, if there's a question you think about once this session is finished, email discoverdorico, all one word, discoverdorico@steinberg.de. And it may be that it's useful for another session in the future, or it may be that actually, I can answer the question anyway by email. So, discoverdorico@steinberg.de. I should also say my colleague Marcus did a similar session to this a week ago, 2 weeks ago, in German. So if you prefer this session in German, check out that session. Just checking more comments. Instrument names, players, read 1. Yeah, leave that one with us, Phil. Space size for 1 page. Oh yes, yeah. I thought you might like that trick, Judith. Oh, I'm glad I can save some people from hours of frustration. I know this is an hour, but hopefully saves you hours of frustration. No dragging, absolutely. Stephen Bashworth says yes, that's useful. Good, and yes, try not to drag things. So good point actually, Daniel, and I meant to mention that about the parts and layouts. If you've made a mistake somewhere and you're not sure about a part and you're thinking, have I made a mistake, or I'm not sure, what's the Dorico default? Or maybe you're thinking, I think I've kind of got there, but actually, what would Dorico do? Instead of deleting all of your changes in setup mode, there's an option over here on the right hand side. You can create new parts. So if I create, if I've made a change to one of these and I click on the little option down here, then I've got an empty part and I can assign an instrument to it. So now I've got an extra flute part as well as the one I was working on. Obviously, you might want to give it a better label. Just double click and give it a better label. But now you can find actually what would the Dorico default settings be? And that might be a good option as a comparison without deleting all the things you've done. It's also a way to have two different scores. You can have a full score as a study version with high density staves, smaller, different paper size, and a full score that you print for a conductor. So you can have different layouts with all of these different options in them, should you want them. The flip side of that is if you've got two parts you want to be the same, you've spent loads of time on horn 1 part, and horn 2 part or horn 3 part is almost exactly the same thematic material, just with different pitches. You can right click on a part here and you can use propagate part formatting, and you can choose the part you're copying from and propagate the layout options and the system information, system formatting information. You can propagate all of those to one or more other parts. So if you spent all of this time setting up one part and setting up page turns and everything else, and basically the person next to them is playing the same thing, you can propagate all those options over and get those same things. And the other thing Daniel mentioned is that there's an option, if you want it, to say, actually create me a default set of part layouts. So if you're saying, I've tweaked a few, but actually create a default set of part layouts, or if you want to, if you've made a mess, you could delete all of the layouts in here, and you could use this option to create a new default set of parts, and then see what Dorico would have done with those. So creating individual extra ones, having a look at those options without deleting your preferences, creating a complete new set, and also propagating the formatting from one part to another, so you don't have to go through all of the same options again for the next new part. Is there a way to make multi-measure rest narrower? Yes, if you have a look at engraving options, then there's the default options, so you can have a look and change them automatically. And Daniel said that. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, you can adjust them, and I manually adjusted them earlier, so hopefully you got that one as well. Yeah, Daniel says I've not been here long because you're on holiday. Answer the question. Good question about instrument changes. Can I move? A completely different one. Daniel's answered that one. No, it isn't possible to change that one. So hopefully you've been reading the chat for that one, and we'll see what we can do with that one in the future. And Mark is also on there and might be able to help you out. I'd also say the community is very good. If you want to have a look on the Facebook community, so go to Facebook and then have a look for the Dorico group. So it's just facebook.com/groups/Dorico. Then people like Mark and myself are on there. Also our forum, of course, dorico.com/forum. And you can ask questions on there, and many useful people and our developers, who are also useful, are on there, and they'll help answer questions as well. Or email me, so discoverdorico@steinberg.de. So I think probably rattle on enough, I think, if there's any other questions. But yes, we'll stay around for a little bit. The live chat will probably only continue for another minute or two once we've finished this session, but you can email and get in touch with us in many other ways. And hopefully this has been another useful session, and maybe kind of just explained how you can get the best out of some of these options, how you can create the layouts and the kind of things you need. So what would you like to see in future sessions? Obviously, we'll try and have a break over Christmas. We may have some news early next year. But what would you like to see in future Discover Dorico sessions? Email us, let us know. And we've got some ideas as well. And so we can have another one of these sessions and chat about all things Dorico. So thank you very much for joining us, and see you again next time.